So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and see what Iran was really like before the 1979 revolution. We're going to explore just how a country that looked like it was speeding towards modernity suddenly took one of the most radical political turns of the 20th century.
I mean, think about it. How does a country go from being one of the most modern societies in the Middle East to becoming one of the strictest religious regimes in the world? It's a huge question, and it gets right to the heart of Iran's incredibly complex history. Back in the 1960s and 70s, Iran seemed to be on a totally different track than what you might picture today. Universities were expanding, cities were modernizing, and on the streets of Tehran, you'd see this really vibrant society soaking up global culture. None of this fits the image most of us have of Iran now, and that just leads to one inevitable question. How could everything change so quickly?
All right, let's dive in. To really get a handle on this, we've got to travel back in time, back to Iran in the 1970s.
I want you to picture this for a second. An avenue just lined with cafes, bookstores, and cinemas. Young people are walking past modern shop windows, some are in jeans, others are in these elegant suits. It honestly sounds like a scene from any European city in the 60s, right? But it's not. This is Tehran.
Over on the university campuses, the air was just filled with debates about philosophy, politics, and science. For a lot of visitors from other countries, Tehran was an absolutely electric city. You had theaters, art galleries, cultural festivals, and a nightlife that could totally hold its own against major European capitals.
And women were carving out a much more visible space in public life. A lot of them were studying at universities, working in hospitals, schools, government offices. In the big cities, seeing women in professional life wasn't the exception anymore. It was quickly becoming the norm.
You'd go into a restaurant and you'd hear Western pop music blending with these beautiful traditional Persian melodies. The streets were just buzzing with students, intellectuals, merchants, and professionals, all part of a society that was getting more and more connected to the rest of the world. All the signs seemed to suggest that Iran was stepping into a brand new era.
But behind this glittering image of progress, there were these deep, simmering tensions. The pace of change was just dizzying. For some, this was a historic opportunity, but for others, it felt like a total rupture, a break with traditions that had defined Iranian identity for generations. So modernization was charging ahead, but not everyone was on board. And in that growing distance, the very first cracks of a much more complex story were beginning to show.
Okay, to understand how Iran changed so fast, we have to look at the man at the center of it all, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was educated in Europe, and he was absolutely convinced that Iran's future depended on just one thing: modernization. His vision was crystal clear and totally uncompromising. Iran had to transform, and it had to happen fast.
So during the 1960s, the government launched this incredibly ambitious set of reforms they called the White Revolution. Now, what's really interesting here is the name. It wasn't a revolution in the way we usually think of one, but it was a massive program of social and economic change, all driven from the top down.
And these reforms were sweeping. Land was redistributed to millions of peasants. The education system exploded, with new schools and universities popping up all over the country. All that oil money was fueling these huge infrastructure projects. We're talking highways, hospitals, factories. And in a major social shift, women got the right to vote.
But as you can imagine, these reforms also stirred up a lot of tension. Some traditional groups, especially within the Shiite clergy, the country's religious authorities and scholars, they looked at all this change with deep, deep concern. They were afraid that the country was just abandoning its cultural and religious values for models imported from the West. For them, modernization wasn't just about the economy, it was changing the very soul of the country.
So Iran's image on the world stage during the 70s was this modern, dynamic country just booming with growth. But that image, well, it didn't tell the whole story.
While the avenues of Tehran were filling up with new cars and shiny international hotels, political power was becoming more and more concentrated in the hands of the Shah. Sure, you had institutions like a parliament, but the really important decisions, they all came directly from the monarch. Political parties had to operate under super strict supervision, and speaking out, well, that came with serious consequences.
And one of the most feared tools of the regime was the intelligence organization known as Savak. This agency's job was to monitor any potential threats, identify opponents, and keep a tight lid on any political movements they thought were dangerous. For a lot of people, this surveillance machine created this constant sense of pressure.
At the same time, this economic boom wasn't benefiting everyone equally.
The rapid growth of cities pulled millions of people in from the countryside. Many came looking for opportunity, but what they found was a housing shortage, not enough jobs, and a rising cost of living. This contrast started to make people really uncomfortable. While some were celebrating the country's progress, others were starting to ask if that progress was actually for everyone.
You know, when social changes happen too fast, societies can react in really unexpected ways. And in Iran, that reaction started popping up in a few different places all at once.
So, in the universities, a lot of students were debating things like democracy, inequality, and political freedom. In nationalist circles, people were criticizing the government for being too close to Western powers. But the most powerful opposition, that started to come from the religious world, from the people who saw themselves as the guardians of the nation's soul.
Within the Shiite clergy, some key figures were watching the country's direction with growing alarm. Among them, one cleric was starting to become famous for his speeches, Ruhollah Khomeini. From exile, he was openly attacking the Shah's policies and warning that the country was losing touch with its religious roots. And his messages, they started spreading among students, merchants, and religious communities.
Now this is the crucial point. The opposition wasn't some big unified movement, not at all. You had groups with wildly different ideas. Some wanted moderate political reforms, others wanted radical social change, and then you had those who wanted to protect traditional values. Really, the only thing they all had in common was this growing feeling of discontent.
So for a big chunk of the 20th century, Iran went through one of the fastest transformations in its entire history. In just a few decades, a deeply traditional society started to see these radical changes, education expanding, cities growing, industry accelerating, and this cultural opening that connected the country with the whole world.
Universities filled up with students, cities got bigger, and women began taking on more and more visible roles. New generations started to imagine a totally different country. It really seemed like Iran was on a one-way track toward modernity. But as we know, history rarely moves in a straight line. The very changes that were fueling all this development were also creating these deep, powerful tensions.
And this really gets to the heart of the issue. You had this ancient country, so proud of its cultural and religious identity, suddenly facing these profound questions about its future. What should we keep? What has to change? And maybe the biggest question of all, who gets to decide? By the late 1970s, Iran was still showing the world its modern face. But just beneath that surface, tensions that had been building for years were transforming the country's political and social climate. In the middle of all these contradictions, the country was slowly but surely moving toward a defining moment in its history, a moment that would change not just the future of Iran, but the political balance of the entire Middle East. Because by the end of that decade, without many people even realizing it yet, the entire nation already had one foot on the threshold of revolution. The story of what happened next is one that literally reshaped the world. To really understand the present, we first have to understand the past. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into pre-revolutionary Iran. So what are your key takeaways from this period of just massive change? Let us know.